So in the last lesson, we hooked up a property binding to the router link directive, passed in a donut ID, and now we need to talk about this ability to set up the capabilities to read a dynamic property from the URL. Now, as we know, each donut ID is completely dynamic, so we need to essentially support this via a router definition. So if we jump into our admin module, we're going to jump down into our routes. Now here we have our donuts/new, and this is important to remember because we're going to have new, and we're also going to have the ability to set whatever that donut ID is. Now instead of specifying ID, the way that we can create a dynamic portion is to use a colon. So this is going to then act as a placeholder. So it's not going to match the word ID. This is a completely dynamic variable. So when we want to access that ID, we would then read the .id property from the URL. But what's important here is we are using the same component for creating a new item and also viewing and updating an existing item. We're just going to intelligently, based on the URL, determine what action we are then taking. So when we then hit save, this then loads our application. We can click on Zesty Lemon, for example, and then we are routed through to that particular view. We can then go back, click on our Just Chocolate. We then get a completely different ID that matches that particular item. So the only point here is, yes, we have created a dynamic route param, but we've not actually fetched the data. So how do we do this? This involves jumping into our donut single component. And at the minute, all we're doing is trying to load an ID that doesn't exist. If we do not have that item, we then load an empty object, which is why we have an empty form. So how do we achieve this? We need to inject a representation of our route. And Angular has this concept of an activated route, which then gives us access to essentially lots of properties and the data behind the current route. So to do this, we'll jump up into our constructor. We can say private. Now what I'm going to do is bump these on new lines because one, we want to make use of some auto completion. But secondly, I like to add Angular logic as the first import. So we're going to say private route, and then we're going to import this activated route. Now you may have seen that we have this activated route snapshot. Personally, I recommend you just to use activated route at all times because it allows us to receive an observable, but not only this, we can access the snapshot anyway. So what we essentially want to do is take the route, make sure you have the activated route imported from Angular's router. We can then jump down into our component. We essentially want to then request some information about the route that we are then on. So inside our ng on init, we're going to say const id equals this.route. This then has a snapshot property, which then contains something called a param map. Now the param map is essentially a newer API that does what it says. It's a map of our route params. It comes with a very nice API that allows us to then specify what param we then want. So really, we don't need to worry about this whole snapshot and param map. This is just a way for us to dive down into Angular's activated route, grab a quick snapshot of what is happening, and then access our param map object, which then gives us a nice get API. We then have this ID given back to us. So let's have a look. We can say console.log ID. We'll save things out, jump into our console. So inside of here, what we should see is the ID for each particular item. So we have Y8Z0AS. We can then jump into another one. We then have another ID. We can then jump into another one and we see this ID. So this ID is important because it is the identifier of each particular item inside of our database. So this is exactly how we can go and fetch that particular item from the server. Now at the moment we have read1 with a hard-coded ID. So what if we take our ID and just simply pass it in here? Now first off, we see argument of type string or null is not assignable to the parameter of type string. Now we're actually handling the functionality of null behind the scenes because if you remember, we're then returning if a donut is not found, an empty object. So what we can in fact do is extend our type definition and just add this use case to say, yes, I know that it might be null, and we're actually okay with that because if it is, we've not found anything, so we're just returning a new object. So we'll save that, close it out. This then brings us to our component. We can then save our donut service change. And now we have whatever item we've clicked on, our caramel swirl, we can go back, just chocolate, go back, zesty lemon. What I want you to also notice is the way that we have handled our state management is allowing us to transition between these essentially immediately. If we were to click one and hit refresh, we then have to wait for our data. But that means if we then go back, everything is then instant because our read is being called under the hood, and then we go and grab that one particular item. So I hope you're getting very excited about this application build at the moment. We've added so much functionality, and it's actually really nice to then start bringing everything together, and it all ends up working perfectly for us. We have a very clean example of an Angular application that addresses a lot of common problems, but not only this, it addresses them in a structured way with a clear separation of concerns, and we're then showing some form reuse alongside some nice architectural patterns. So in the next lesson, what I want to do is pass some root information down so we can then start to hide and show the correct buttons on our form. Because at the moment, our create, update, and delete buttons are available regardless of which item we are clicking on, a new form or an existing item.